Hey everybody, Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. I want to welcome you back to our continuing coverage of the Gettysburg 159th anniversary. And we're on the Gettysburg battlefield here on Cemetery Ridge. Most of you are probably asking where Gary Edelman is. He is running across the fields like this probably, trying to interpret with Tim Smith. No, in reality, he is over at the Sacred Trust Book Talks. He's over at the Gettysburg Foundation, one of our great partners at the American Battlefield Trust. So if you haven't checked out the Gettysburg Foundation, check out their website, gettysburgfoundation.org, and that will tell you more about what their mission is. If you ever visited the Visitor Center within the last 10 years or the Cyclorama, they help to oversee those buildings and those building operations. Wayne Mott's one of our friends, Carol Reardon, another one of our friends. They're both the president and on the board respectively. And if you watched last year's coverage, you would have seen David Malgi, who is the former board chairperson for the Gettysburg Foundation. Great partner, great guy. So we encourage you to check out everything at Gettysburg Foundation. Check out those Sacred Trust Book Talks. A lot of those show up on YouTube as well. So before we get started here, I want to get you oriented. We're going to talk a little bit about logistics here in the Gettysburg campaign. It's something that doesn't get covered all that often, but they are very, very important because we have to get our armies up here, but we also have to supply them. We have to feed the men. We have to get ammunition up here. We have to get medical supplies, everything. These are essentially mobile cities, and you have to keep them moving on the march. You have to keep these men fed. You have to keep them clothed, and you have to make sure that whenever they have this, that this helps to keep their morale high. There's one thing to go across this countryside like Robert E. Lee's army does and starts picking those cherries that we talk about, flapjacks and mountains like you see in the Gettysburg movie, but that's not going to be enough to sustain your army for a long term. So out here, what we're going to do is point out where we're standing, and then I'm going to bring on Doug Douds, little jerk there, the camera. That is a cannon going off behind us. That's a firing demonstration going on here at the park. So just over behind me is the Taj Mahal looking monument. That is the Pennsylvania Memorial with more than 34,000 names of every Pennsylvanian who served here. You'll see Winged Victory at the top facing off towards the Confederate lines at Seminary Ridge. We're on the east side of Cemetery Ridge. There's placards on that monument for every unit that fought here from Pennsylvania, and then some non-Pennsylvanians on that monument, like Abraham Lincoln. He has a bust, or he has a standing statue up there, and you'll also see other Pennsylvanians like Andrew Curtin, the wartime governor, and George Gordon Meade and others. So it's a really important landmark here at Gettysburg. So that'll give you an idea of where we're standing. So Cemetery Ridge proper is right behind me. Then on the other side of Cemetery Ridge will be an open ground. Those are the fields of Pickett's Charge, and then Seminary Ridge. To the north is the town of Gettysburg. A little less than a mile from where we're standing will be the outskirts of Gettysburg. And off in that direction will also be George Gordon Meade's headquarters. That's the Lydia Leister Farm. Over behind me here is the Taneytown Road. You might be able to see some traffic going up and down the Taneytown Road. That's one of the major thoroughfares coming in and out of the town of Gettysburg. It's one of two roads that the Union Army controls the entire battle, the Taneytown Road as well as the Baltimore Pike. The Taneytown Road at the time of the battle is pretty beat up, and a lot of the Union soldiers talk about just how terrible of a road it is. The men who are riding on the limber chests of the artillery pieces have to get off because they're getting thrown off, or it's so uncomfortable of a ride. So think about that when we talk about logistics. There might be 10 roads coming in and out of Gettysburg, but are all of them improved? Are all of them going to be under your control of your army? Then, of course, we're going to look down Cemetery Ridge here just for a moment. You probably won't be able to see it, but you'll be looking off in the directions of the Round Tops, Little Round Top, Big Round Top, just down the ridge behind me, less than a mile from where we're standing. So we are in and behind the Union lines. This is what we would consider part of the Union Nerve Center. You would see a lot of horsemen riding around back here, staff officers, orderlies, and others along the Taneytown Road, as well as the Baltimore Pike off in the far, far distance. You would see wagon trains coming up here. You would see artillery pieces. You would see men and material moving back and forth. So this is an important part of the battlefield. You can notice it's a very important cut through for folks getting around here today because these are interior lines that the Federals had. So to talk a little bit more about the logistics side of things, the support troops that probably don't get enough recognition, I'm going to bring on Colonel Doug Douds of the U.S. Army War College. Doug, please take it away.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, hey, a real pleasure to be here today. One of the groups I want to talk about, and I want to talk about it because this monument exists here. It's about a group of soldiers who aren't even here, and yet they put their monument here, and rightly so. This is to the engineers of the Army of the Potomac. You can see the shape of the monument in the shape of a castle. This would be the branch insignia of U.S. engineers. Also, if you take a hard look up on each side of the castle, it has a little motto that says "Essayons," which would be "Let us try." This would be the motto of engineers, and it becomes important for us to understand engineers, certainly at the beginning of the Civil War. We know the United States Army is only 16,000 strong at that time. At the beginning of the Civil War, there's 97 engineers, and at that point, it's actually a sprint branch. You were a topographical engineer, responsible for map making mostly, and then the other side, these would be the guys responsible for building earthworks or building houses or bridges or lighthouses for that matter. Now, what's going to happen is those two branches are ultimately going to be combined in February of 1863. But think where we are pre-war. 97 engineers, one company raised just in time for the Mexican War. At this point in the American Civil War, 1863, there are 17 companies of engineers. This is how we've grown this capability, because effectively what we were trying to do is provide operational mobility for these armies out in the field. These would be made up of the 15th New York, which is going to have a handful of companies. The 50th New York has 12 companies, and the U.S. regulars have 4 companies of engineers. What does this translate to? Think about this. For an Army of the Potomac that once it starts to pursue Robert E. Lee as he's coming north on this invasion, they're going to cover 3 states, 10 counties in order to get to this battlefield. And so when we think about the idea of, hey, they got to cross the Potomac River, that means that on the 20th to the 21st, entirely in a no illumination night, engineers are going to build a 1,200-foot pontoon bridge across Edwards Ferry. Then they're going to build another one in 3 hours on the 25th, and the entire Army of the Potomac will cross the Potomac River in 65 hours. So every time you come around this battlefield and you start to talk about, hey, these troops arrive on the field with 5 minutes to spare. These guys arrive or they charge out there with 30 seconds to spare. Translate that back over time between the 25th and the 27th of February when the entire Army crosses in 65 hours. This is operational mobility. This is the building, the building of a capacity and capability. Effectively, how do we make future luck? And it's one of the ways we've done this is we built this mobility. And so it's interesting, if you look, we actually see on the monument here, you can see the 2 pontoon bridges that they built at Edwards Ferry, that these would have been right next to each other. We can even see the mobility that they would have had to put these things on wagons so that they would carry their pontoon bridges with them. This is now the opportunity for the whole Army to be able to move in a colossal scale. And maybe one of the best examples of this would be in June of 1864, when the Union Army will pull out of Cold Harbor. They will build a pontoon bridge in just over 9 hours that will span nearly 2,147 feet of the James River. And we shouldn't think this is a small thing. This is going to change the character of that campaign. But we shouldn't be surprised to see the personalities involved. This would be Captain Turnbull and General Benham. These were the same men who helped build these bridges during the Gettysburg campaign, now translating that capability and capacity into operational mobility later on. So engineers, somebody we should keep in mind. This also talks about the growing complexity of armies in this era. We often talk about, hey, the Civil War is the last of the old wars and the first of the new. One of the things that is starting to happen is the growth of armies is growing in size. And with that, they're growing in complexity, so that we need technical experts, signalmen, commissary officers, ordnance officers, quartermasters, artillerists, engineers, and now if you think about things like the Bureau of Military Information and all-source intelligence gathering organization within the Army of the Potomac. And this is why all of a sudden it's not just a commander who merely with the sweep of an eye is able to weigh all these things that can be considered and translate that into activities on a battlefield. Rather now, we need a commander who has a bunch of trusted subordinates, staff officers, who are experts in their field to not only lead these specific capabilities and the men that operate inside them, in this case almost 1,000 men that are engineers, but also to provide that expertise back to the boss, to handle these thorny problems, to come up with unique approaches to the very difficult problems of an army faces while on the march or in the midst of campaign. Think about that as just friction. And when we think about what this translates to here, George Gordon Meade can look to his chief engineer, in this case Gouverneur K. Warren, and on July 2nd when he sends him up to Little Round Top as a trusted agent, a directed telescope as it were, to use his judgment to think about what needs to go on the field. And then we compare that to Robert E. Lee and his army, we see a dearth of staff work on that side. So that to the point at 1 o'clock in the morning on July 2nd, after Meade has got done with his midnight council of war, Robert E. Lee is trying to figure out where he can find a guy who's familiar with fords across the Potomac River. That's old-fashioned staff work that somebody else should have been doing and not a commanding officer, at least if you would ask me. Now, when we think about this, we talked about the Taneytown Road. 10 roads radiate out of Gettysburg like spokes on a wheel to all points of the compass. But here at Gettysburg, the Union Army only controls 2 of them. We've talked about, and Kris mentioned how bad the Taneytown Road is. The other one is the Baltimore Pike. And when we say pike, we should think about it. Okay, it's 1863. Roads are made of dirt. Got it. Unless you start to see the word pike. And then what we should picture is crushed gravel and crowned an all-weather road. It's one of the reasons Meade spends a lot of the morning on July 2nd concerned about his right. He's mirror imaging, saying, if I were Robert E. Lee, I would turn my own right. Because he knows that with that all-purpose road, that all-weather road, one, if the weather turns bad and this battle goes bad, this is his escape route to get the Army out of here. Moreover, for as long as they're here, it's also his jugular vein to get supplies onto this battlefield. Now, truth be told, regular procedure in the Army of the Potomac is, once we start to concentrate on the 1st of July when Meade starts to send his army here, that means the wagons get out of the way. So most of those are going to go back. We talk about going to Westminster, where his local rail hub is, within 25 miles. That means what he's doing is he's going to sacrifice some of his operational mobility to achieve tactical mobility, speed his concentration of his trigger pullers, cannoneers, infantrymen. But that means also that a lot of his supplies are left. So it doesn't surprise us that we see one of those routine orders on June 30th when Meade will issue 3 days rations so that his men can have those on hand. Now, if you're a good infantryman, you can take those rations and you can put in that leather knapsack that you're going to carry around in 80-degree weather. Or if you're a good infantryman, you could carry them right here. Eat all 3 days up front and worry about how you're going to get fed 2 days later. What does this translate to? Here at the Battle of Gettysburg, by the time we get to July 3rd, we talk about infantrymen who are starving, who are begging artillerists, hey, do you guys have any food? Because effectively, Meade has had to shut that down in order to get his army here. And it wouldn't really be until those food and supplies would arrive here on July 4th, and in particularly the 5th, that now he starts to refeed his army to get them with their legs back underneath that will ultimately need to pursue. The other thing Kris talked about was a little bit of the logistics side, and we should keep this in mind. You know, a Union Army here is going to fire nearly 32,000 rounds of artillery. Well, that's great, except, okay, how do we resupply that? We talk about some of the problems that the Confederates run into on July 3rd during what we know as Longstreet's assault or Pickett's charge, when they run out of artillery ammunition, or they're starting to run out of artillery ammunition. When this is all done, Henry Hunt, the chief of Union artillery, is utterly concerned about the resupply. This is where he has his ghost wagon train, for which he's able to resupply, well, 1st Corps and the 11th Corps after the first day's fight, because those wagons, they had left their wagons back. And so now he's able to go ahead and give them supplies. In fact, when the whole Battle of Gettysburg's over, Hunt would say, we had enough ammunition to fight the whole thing all over again. Now, for Lieutenant Flagler, whose responsibility, Captain Flagler, who's class of 1861, he's the ordnance officer. He will reorder 1 million rounds of ammunition. He will order, eventually he'll correct his request for artillery ammunition. He'll request 4,000 rounds of 12-pound ammunition for the Napoleons and 4,000 rounds of 3-inch ammunition, and then about 1,500 rounds of 2.9-inch. Now, that'll go down, but when it gets translated across the telegraph wires, it's going to get to Washington, D.C., and it's translated as 40,000 rounds. Nobody blinks an eye at this. If you want to talk about the industrial capacity of the Union to support armies in the field, when the Army of the Potomac gets down to Frederick, there's going to have 40,000 rounds of both of those there, in which Flagler will now pick this all up, and the Union Army will be materially ready to fight all over again. And it just doesn't happen on the ammunition side. You know, we talk about Jonathan Letterman, truly an innovator when it comes to the medical capacity of the Army of the Potomac. He will leave 106 surgeons here at Gettysburg to account for all the wounded that they leave behind. He'll request 50 surgeons meet him in Frederick. 47 show up. And on the day that he picks them up, he writes that the medical department was ready to fight another Gettysburg-sized battle right after they passed through Frederick. Think about what that means. Within a week after having fought the largest, bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, the Army of the Potomac is material ready to fight another largest battle of the Civil War all over again. Now, we know leadership-wise, organizational, the loss, there's many other factors that might impact the capability and capacity of the Army of the Potomac to fight another battle. But material, that staff-level work to provide all the resources that these soldiers might need to fight that battle, that has been put in place. So we know logistics is important. We talk about armies march on their bellies. This is one of those little talked about aspects that takes place behind the lines, back behind these main battlefields, behind the battlefields that we see out in front, and a crucial piece to how armies need to operate, and part of that complexity of what it looks like for a modern army to fight in a modern battlefield. Kris?
As usual, that was fantastic, Doug. I loved how you put everything together. A couple things I want to unpack real fast. Number one, Henry Benham, who's in charge of the engineers up here, at least the pontooniers. He's in charge of the engineer brigade. He's a West Point graduate, number one, 1837. A lot of the engineers themselves, like a McClellan or others, would graduate either at the top or very close to the top of their class. But I have some favorite stories of him from the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, when he was, quote unquote, in a beastly state of intoxication. You know, this was his first battle in charge of the engineer brigade. He rides down to the Rappahannock River. There's Confederates on the other side. He starts screaming in the night. And this is supposed to be a, you know, concealed, a secret operation, that they're going to kill all of us. And right behind is the Sixth Corps guys. As they're standing there, you know, they're just like, oh my Lord, what's this crazy man doing? He falls off his horse. He cuts his face. He said he looked like a Comanche, one of the guys said, with war paint on. You know, so Benham, I think, gets it together after that campaign. He stops in the middle of the Chancellorsville campaign and writes a 12-page report about what's going on. So that says a lot about him. The other thing that always hits me is Gouverneur Kimball Warren. When he takes over the Chief Topographical Engineer office, I think it's February 6th of 63, he puts in for his budget. And do you know what his budget is?
No.
I'm not playing Stump the Historian
No,
here.
this is good.
$1,500. And he thought that was excessive to run the department for him. And if you put that into perspective today, that's less than $30,000 in modern money. And he thought that this was crazy. So the Chief Topographical Engineer is asking for about $30,000 to run the department for that year. And I mean, to think about, you know, what the capacity of the Union was, what they're spending on the war, he writes home to his fiance, Emily, and says, you know, I'm worried. They're not going to give me my budget. It's like, they have 400,000 rounds of ammunition they could pull up. But, you know, there's no problem here. And I think that brings up something that's very important to remember. When the war starts, for every factory worker in the South, there's a factory in the North. You know, so the capacity for that war making, at least on the industrial level, is really set that bar very high. And I think that's what the American war effort's always about. I think, to me, that's one of those tenets of the American way of war. We might be slow to get going, but once we get you get the mechanics going forward, like World War I, World War II, the Civil War, once we get all that rolling forward, you can't stop that machine.
I think it's a really important point, and maybe I think we've talked about this before, but I think it's always worth reiterating. This is one of the things, you know, you think about what does the Civil War deliver for us as a nation? You know, at the beginning of the war, if you were a person and you grew up in your hometown, you may have been a horse ride away from your house in a day. You know, maybe 12 miles away. But if you went and served in Grant's army out in the Western Theater, you went from Minnesota, and then you went down the Mississippi River, and then you joined Sherman's army, you went to Atlanta, and then you fought your way to Savannah. You ended the war in North Carolina, went in the Victory Parade up in Washington, D.C. Then they put you on a train that took you to New York and Buffalo and then Chicago. You just saw the entire United States of America. We became a mobile society. And, oh, by the way, we went from a 16,000-man army to nearly a 1,000,000-man army. We start to organize on a colossal scale at the birth of the Industrial Revolution. So now we start to think big, which I would argue leads us to an American century when we fight all those other wars with this American way of war.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense, Doug. You're with the American Battlefield Trust, Colonel Doug Douds with the U.S. Army War College. I'm Kris White, Sarah Byerly behind the camera. I want to share this with your friends and with your family, and we really appreciate you watching our Gettysburg 159 coverage. One other thing I wanted to unpack quickly, Doug, with you is Henry Hunt, the Chief of Artillery here at Gettysburg. Can we talk a little bit about his role here at Gettysburg versus Chancellorsville, and how, you know, we have a different commander at Chancellorsville, Joseph Hooker, 48 years old, Hadley, Massachusetts native, West Point graduate of the class of 37, and then we put him up against George Gordon Meade. Two different command styles and two different uses of their Chief of Artillery. How does that play out?
Yeah, this is really good. So we don't actually have defined roles yet for these. It's meant that you're going to be a staff officer, but it doesn't necessarily mean, does that mean you're going to stay at headquarters all the time, or do you have operational responsibilities? Hunt has kind of bounced back and forth. Under McClellan, he was more operationalized. Hooker said, hey, you are just on my staff. I just need you to be an expert. When Meade takes over, oh, by the way, they don't talk about this relationship when they have their change of command. Hooker doesn't talk to Meade about this, and Meade never has a direct conversation about Hunt. But soon Hunt realizes Meade is using him in an operational capacity. When he has him go out and take a look at the Pipe Creek line and how artillery might be used there, and certainly once he gets on the battlefield. As Hunt would say during the Joint Committee of the Conduct of the War, he understood his role as having been operationalize, that he had operational command responsibilities out on this battlefield, which is why you find Henry Hunt nearly everywhere, providing direction, putting batteries in place, directing artillerists to how they might employ their artillery, and even making the call on July 3rd during the bombardment before Pickett's charge or Longstreet's assault to slow down the rate of fire, if not altogether stop, that they might preserve some of those rounds. The interesting with Hunt, best artillerist in the American Civil War, totally organized, trains his young men, writes the documents that will provide the doctrine that they will use, helps oversee the quality of ammunition and the manufacture of gun. It's why Union artillery is always top notch. If we want to talk about another staff position that I would also argue that Meade modifies, Alfred Pleasanton's not a terribly great cavalry officer. They're not doing a good job of breaking Confederate cavalry screens. And so Meade will de-operationalize him and say, I want you to put your tent in your mind for the rest of the day, effectively empowering really talented division commanders to provide information back to the Army of the Potomac that will hit Pleasanton's tent right next to Meade's tent, so that he can now increase the speed of information flow to help make his decisions.
I think it's amazing how you broke that down, how to work around a problem child like Alfred Pleasanton. Eric Wittenberg, one of my good friends, he's very harsh on Alfred Pleasanton. He calls him a compulsive liar whenever it comes to dealing with anything that he's doing intelligent-wise, which is an oxymoron, I think, with Alfred Pleasanton at times. The guy's a big self-promoter and always trying to build himself up. But like you said, they brought up these young guys who were ready and willing and able to perform here on the field. Anything else you want to add about logistics in the Federal Army on this side?
No, what we should just keep in mind is, and even, we think about the quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac is Rufus Ingalls, and he talks about that almost every quartermaster by this point in the war had been trained. So when they come up with the idea of clear the wagons and get them out of the way, everybody knew what that meant. So what does that translate to? I would argue, when George Gordon Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac, he doesn't have to think about anything that takes place behind the Army of the Potomac. That's staff work, and he's got very talented staff officers. So he can concentrate with every minute that he's in command of how does he try and fight Robert E. Lee. And because he can focus on him, I think Robert E. Lee has to spend time doing almost everything else as well as trying to fight George Gordon Meade in the Army of the Potomac. This is one of those other areas where we find a margin of difference between success and failure here at the battlefield at Gettysburg.
Awesome. So let's take a walk just around the backside of this monument for a moment and switch over to the Confederate side. And you would probably think it's kind of a strange spot to stand here and discuss for just a moment a Confederate story on the backside of Cemetery Ridge. But what we have to remember is that while the Confederate assaults are coming towards where I'm standing from the west towards the east, there are going to be a large number of casualties that are sustained right near where we are. And one of those casualties will be a man named William Barksdale. He's a 41-year-old Tennessee native, but made famous for leading a Mississippi brigade here at Gettysburg. To me, pound for pound, his brigade does some of the hardest fighting on July 2nd for James Longstreet's forces. Essentially, Barksdale is a dog on a leash. He just wants to be let off throughout the afternoon. He keeps asking James Longstreet, put me in, coach, put me in, coach. And James Longstreet will say a few different times, to paraphrase him, we'll all go in presently. We'll all be going in presently. And eventually, Barksdale gets the call, and his men will go towards the tip of the salient that is Dan Sickles' line along the left flank of the Federal Army down at the Peach Orchard. And what ends up happening is that 3 of Barksdale's regiments, Mississippi regiments, will hit kind of on an angle up onto the Emmitsburg Road, while the 21st Mississippi under Benjamin Humphreys, a West Point guy who got kicked out of West Point, comes swinging around and drives up into the Peach Orchard towards the 9th Massachusetts Battery and some other famous fighting there. And the salient is crushed from 2 sides by Barksdale's men. And Barksdale will keep driving his men hard and fast up the Emmitsburg Road. One man said that Old Barks, as he was known to his men, said, crowd them. We have them on the run. Move your regiments, he bellowed above the din of battle. Can nothing stop these desperate Mississippians, one Southern officer asked. And then he answered his own question later on. He said, death. And what he talks about is the death of William Barksdale. Barksdale was wounded in the saddle. General Barksdale was wounded and he reeled, but did not halt, said his nephew Harris Barksdale. And he is going to keep pushing forward, trying to keep these men going forward, and eventually Barksdale will fall off of his horse and he'll be captured by Union soldiers. He's actually taken to the farm behind me, that white farm. That's the Jacob Hummelbaugh farm, where he'll be laid down in the farmyard, and he'll be tended to by a surgeon in the 148th Pennsylvania, Alfred T. Hamilton. Hamilton described Barksdale as a large, corpulent, refined in appearance, bold, and in his general physical and mental makeup indicated firmness, endurance, vigor, quick perception. He was dressed in the jeans of their choice, meaning the Confederates' choice, jean wool. His short roundabout was trimmed on the sleeves with a gold braid. The Mississippi button with a star in the center closed it. The collar had 3 stars on each side next to his chin. Next to his body was a fine linen or cotton shirt, which was closed by 3 studs bearing Masonic emblems. His pants had 2 stripes of gold braid, half an inch broad, down each leg. So he's describing what Barksdale looks like. He's describing essentially what looked like colonel stars on his collar, and he's talking about his Austrian braid that would have been on his coat, differentiating him from a private or an NCO, showing that he's an officer, as well as the stripes down his legs. Now, one of my favorite descriptions comes from the 33rd New York Infantry of Barksdale's death here at Gettysburg. The 33rd didn't fight here. They fought Barksdale at the Battle of 2nd Fredericksburg. And they talk about fighting Barksdale there at 2nd Fredericksburg. And this unit actually fell out of the ranks, or their enlistments ran out right before Gettysburg. But they write their regimental history in the midst of the Civil War in 1864. So this is a little bit more flowery than you would imagine. One regimental historian said, "The haughty and supercilious Barksdale breathed his life away on the crimson fields of Gettysburg, abandoned by his own men, without a slave even to bring him a cold cup of water." So I thought that was just a fantastic description of it, and a little bit of a dig towards Barksdale. So I looked into it a little bit more. There was someone here actually bringing him a cold cup of water. And ironically, it's a Federal soldier from the 148th Pennsylvania. His name is Robert Cassidy. Cassidy is a musician with the 148th Pennsylvania. They're part of Edward Cross's brigade here at Gettysburg, or is that John Rutter Brooke? 1st Division, they're in Caldwell's division of the 1st Division 2nd Corps. Too many units on the top of my head. But the musician who's been left behind because the 1st Division had been camped in this area is back over at the Hummelbaugh farm acting as an aide to one of the doctors. And he said, "I came upon the general accidentally. Kneeling at his side, I asked him if he desired any assistance. He informed me that he was very thirsty, and I endeavored to give him water from the canteen, but was unable to do so in consequence of his recumbent position and the pain from his wounds. Taking my spoon from my haversack, I filled it several times, and the general drank the water feverishly and avidly. The lung was cut, and at every inhalation the blood was forced copiously with a sputtering noise from the wound. Noticing that his strength was failing rapidly, I continued to administer water, dissolved morphine, and diluted liquor alternatively until I saw he was on the edge of the dark river." So, even though the 33rd New York tries to take a dig at Barksdale, talking about a slave not here to bring him a cold cup of water, here's Robert Cassidy, a man in the 148th Pennsylvania from a different side of the war, who will come here and take care of this fallen Southern general. And Cassidy will write some other things about the death of Barksdale. Barksdale dies the next day. He's wounded on July 2nd. He dies on July 3rd, and he's buried off behind me, allegedly near a cherry tree. And his crude headboard said, "Brigadier General Barksdale of Mississippi, McLaw's Division, Longstreet's Corps, died on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, 8 years, a representative in the United States Congress, shot through the left breast and leg broken below the knee." In January of 1867, his body was exhumed from the Gettysburg battlefield and sent to South Carolina, where it was later retrieved by Harris Barksdale, one of his aides here at Gettysburg, and it was buried, I believe, in Greenwood Cemetery in Jackson, Mississippi, which is about 30 minutes outside of Vicksburg, if you've ever been out there. So there's a lot happening back here along these lines. It's not just talking about logistics. We're not just talking about cannon. We're not talking just about materiel. We're talking about real-life human stories playing out back here. And after the war, Cassidy will actually write to Barksdale's widow to let her know where the body was buried. She'll also talk to a doctor here in town, John W.C. O'Neill, who will help to locate the body and have it sent back down to the south. So there's a lot playing out here behind the Union line. So if you ever drive back past the Pennsylvania Memorial and you head your way back to the Taneytown Road, check out the Engineers Monument. It's not a monument just to drive past. And check out the Hubblebaugh Farm, which is just down by the park's maintenance facility, or one of their maintenance facilities. And you can see where William Barksdale died. And if you want to step into that scene, the American Civil War, the American Battlefield Trust has actually put together an augmented reality app for here at Gettysburg, where you can step into some of the iconic scenes that happened here at Gettysburg, including the death of Barksdale, the Gettysburg Address, and you can even go see Robert E. Lee at his own headquarters over at Lee's headquarters on the Chambersburg Pike. On behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching. Thanks to Doug Douds from the U.S. Army War College. Thank you to Sarah K. Byerly behind the camera. And thanks to you for watching and supporting battlefield preservation and education.